Ghulāt and Gnosticism with Dr. Mushegh Asatryan. Today we will be exploring the question, is Ghulāt religion Islamic Gnosticism? With Associate Professor Dr. Mushegh Asatryan. Dr. Mushegh holds an MA from the Central European University as well as a Master's in Philosophy from Yale University and a PhD in Islamic Studies from the same institution. His research interests include religious, cultural, and social history of the medieval Islamic Middle East, interface between religion, culture, and society, Islamic history, as well as Shiism. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us today. I'll start off with a quick question. Which beliefs set the Ghulāt apart from other Muslims?
Thank you so much, Ziryab, for having me, and I'm glad to be sharing my work with you and with your listeners. Now, your question can be answered in two different ways. Which beliefs set the Ghulāt apart from their contemporary Muslims, and which beliefs set them apart from later Muslims? I will begin with the second question. That's the simpler and shorter answer. Most of their beliefs set them apart from the way the Islamic religion and belief were formulated in later centuries by Muslim theologians and thinkers. For example, their belief in the reincarnation of souls. Most Muslims later on and today do not hold that belief. Their belief that some of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad are superhuman beings or semi-divine beings. That also has been considered very heretical and incorrect by most Muslims in the centuries to come. The idea that, for example, the righteous are reborn into lighter bodies after their death and then move up the spiritual hierarchy into the divine realm, and the sinners are reborn into lower, filthier bodies and turn into animals or inanimate objects. That's another belief. And finally, also the belief in, for example, the 7 Adams who have lived on 7 heavens. That's also another belief that may sound very, very, in fact, unusual and bizarre to most Muslims, both today and let's say in the 10th century. Now, the other aspect of this question, how different were their beliefs from their contemporary Muslims? We don't know, because much of Islamic belief was formulated long after the Ghulāt were dead or were dying out. However, we know that during the time when they lived, which was the 1st century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and then probably another century and a half, there was huge doctrinal diversity in the Islamic community. Now, when we look back today, both academics and non-academics, we assume uniformity of belief in practice. We sort of think many people will look back, both those who study Islam as a historical phenomenon and those who practice it, sort of the impression is that most Muslims have more or less believed the same thing since right after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, which is incorrect, because most of the classical hallmark beliefs of the Islamic religion were formulated decades after his death. So right after the Prophet Muhammad's death and during the time when the Ghulāt were around, their beliefs were probably different, but probably not as bizarre or heretical to other Muslims as they would become later.
And you mentioned that amongst these beliefs were the notion of reincarnation and rebirth into human and sometimes subhuman forms.
Mm-hmm.
Could you kindly explore some more of these cosmological and theological themes that the Ghulāt embody?
Yes. So this idea is, the idea of reincarnation is part of a larger scheme of the Ghulāt universe, is built into it, is sort of part of the whole architecture of the world as the Ghulāt imagined it, both physical and spiritual, So for them, the entire existence was part of a large, long ladder that stretched between an ineffable and unknowable God, down into the world of angels, and down into the world of humans, and then further down into the worlds of animals, plants, inanimate beings, etc. So it was sort of a hierarchical ladder where at the top you have absolute goodness and light and spirituality. And the further down you go, you have less of that light and less of that spirituality and less and more of matter. And matter was by definition evil. So when people died, so the Ghulāt believed, they were reborn. If they did okay in their lives, they were neither very good nor very bad. They would be reborn into another human being, which was not ideal, but it was all right. If they were righteous, they would move up the ladder of spiritual hierarchy. And there are different accounts of this hierarchy. The most widely spread account says that there are seven degrees of spiritual hierarchy, and the higher up you move, the more purity and light you get, and the less matter and evil. So it gets purified. So the better you are in this life, the likelier you are to end up in a higher degree. And then in the next life, you go even higher until in the very end, there is a very interesting description of the highest degree of spiritual hierarchy. It's called Bab, or gate, or door. It doesn't say explicitly who these Babs are, but there are several descriptions of these people. So a Bab is someone who is the purest of humans, who has rid himself or herself of the shackles of matter and bodily attachments and carnal desires, and has become very pure spiritually. And there are several very interesting stories about what these people can do. Essentially, they become almost like semi-divine beings. They can travel across huge distances. They can appear here and then appear across thousands of miles in the next moment. They can walk the earth in human garb and talk to people, and people will have no idea who these people are, but in fact, they are these semi-divine beings, and then they go back to their spiritual realm. So that's the good part. Those who have been sinning, those who have not been good, they become reborn into lower forms, and the lower forms are essentially in the hierarchical order animals, and then plants, and then minerals or inanimate beings. And then among animals, there is also a hierarchy. You could imagine, for example, beautiful horses are higher on the hierarchy than the dogs, and then the frogs are even lower, and then the snakes and scorpions and so forth. And then the most sinning get reborn into rocks and pieces of wood, etc. So a rather grim picture of sinners, I must say. The idea of rebirth is also used as sort of a reward and punishment mechanism. For example, and not all the texts share this idea, but there are several accounts which say that the way you are in life, in this body, the way you treat others in this body, in this life, you will be treated the same way in the next. So for example, if you beat someone in this life, you will be reborn into someone who is being beaten by someone else. Let's say if you're a sinning person and then you eat an animal, which in itself is not a sin, but if you are a sinning person and eat an animal, eat the flesh of an animal, then you will be reborn into that animal and someone else will eat you. So sort of a very tit for tat picture where you get what you give others.
And there's this idea of tanassukh that you mentioned in the paper, that I want to move to a group that you mentioned in the paper,
the Mukhamissa and the Ala'iyya.
If you could tell us a bit more about that particular group.
Yeah, those who believe that 5 members of the Prophet's family are, and again, it's hard to give them a hard and fast definition, but are sort of semi-divine beings who have been sent to this world, to create the world and to care for it. And these people were called Mukhamissa. In Arabic, it means, sort of those who divide things into five. It's not a good translation. There is no ideal translation for that word. So those five members were the Prophet Muhammad, his cousin and son-in-law Ali, Ali's wife, and their two sons, Hassan and Hussein. And there are different accounts. Sometimes instead of Hassan, there's another person called Muhsin, who was Ali's unborn son. And so this is a variation of the Ghulāt myth of divine or semi-divine human beings. There's lots of variation in their texts. In fact, they are not very uniform. So in some of them, it's these five individuals. In others, there is essentially any descendant of the Prophet Muhammad's family who is this semi-divine human being who is tasked with the creation or care for the universe, for the world, or for human affairs and so forth. There is also, you use the word al-Ya'iyya. It's another version of a similar belief. Now, these people believed that, again, there is these only five, but the chief among them is not the Prophet Muhammad, but Ali ibn Abi Talib, his son-in-law and cousin. Yeah. But essentially, otherwise, the beliefs were similar.
Right. And so the idea of a first light, I wonder what, if any, influence there was from Sufi groups who view the Muhammadan light as the first created thing.
Yes, so there wasn't an influence from Sufi groups because Sufism, as a sort of a coherent movement or a set of movements, and a school of thought emerged and coalesced later, in fact, after the Ghulāt had largely disappeared. So there is no direct influence. However, there is evidence that a number of different groups and people believed in this light symbolism among early Muslims. And some of them were the Ghulāt. There were no doubt others whose descendants would become Sufis. So I would reformulate the question this way. It's not that the Sufis influenced the Ghulāt or vice versa, but both the Ghulāt and the Sufis were the product of the same very diverse confessional early Islamic environment where various ideas were circulated and in conflict sometimes, and were vying for the status of the correct type of Islamic belief. Some of them lost, some of them won out. Some of them became what later would become as, for example, Sunni Islam or Twelver Islam, and some of them were pushed to the side as heresy, for example, the beliefs of the Ghulāt and some Sufis as well.
Let's delve into this milieu. Especially as it relates to the Azilla, the shadows and the phantom, the dark world and reincarnation, and their parallel in Judeo-Christian movement.
Yes. Yes. So one of the most very interesting ideas of the Ghulāt is that before the world was created, there were eternal lights who lived near God, who were either created by him or were co-eternal with him. There are different accounts. And they praised him, and then God decided to create the world, and these lights then populated the bodies of the Prophet Muhammad and the Imams and some other individuals. So these were, in Arabic, they are called Azilla and or Ashbah. And in the Ghulāt's own literature, which comprises about 30 treatises, some of them are preserved very fragmentarily, so like a page here, a page there, but some of them are quite long. So we have several works spanning 200 pages, 150 pages, and they describe these Azilla in quite some detail. So, for example, the opening story of creation runs like this. First, there was God and nothing else. Then he decided to create the Azilla and Ashbah, and the Azilla and Ashbah worshipped him. and praised him. And from their praise, God created the believers. And then the story goes, there are several different versions about this. And of course, this idea, again, is not entirely original in the sense that the Ghulāt did not invent it out of thin air, but it was part of this large sectarian milieu that existed in Mesopotamia or in the broader Middle Eastern region in the earlier centuries of the Common Era. And it included a variety of movements, which may be termed early Christian or Gnostic. Some of them were Manichaeans, Judeo-Christians, or Jewish Christians, that's another term, used for certain early Christian groups. And many of the ideas of the Ghulāt have parallels in the beliefs of some of these groups. So when we look at the teachings of the Ghulāts, we see this huge, extremely diverse confessional environment that existed in the Near East prior and after the emergence of Islam, sort of as in a snapshot, as if these Ghulāts were walking around and collecting interesting beliefs and interesting stories and writing them down and creating sort of their own vision of the world. This is, of course, an idealized image. Most probably it didn't happen this way, but all of these ideas were in the air when the Ghulāt were around. So they must have influenced their thinking.
And if we can move on to the two interesting personalities of Bayan ibn Saman al-Tamimi, the 8th century rebel, and Abdullah ibn Muawiyah, and tell us a bit more about these individuals.
So these two individuals, they rebelled. One of them rebelled in the year 737 and the other in 744, I believe, in Iraq. And they had very different fates. Bayan, when he rebelled, with a very small number of followers, in fact, his rebellion was swiftly put down, and he and his followers met a very gruesome death. They were tied to tar-soaked reeds and set afire. Abdullah ibn Muawiyah was much more successful. He was, in fact, a very shrewd politician. He was known for his poetic talent, also for his ruthlessness. He managed to turn his rebellion into a very successful affair. He was defeated in Kufa in Iraq, but he fled to eastern Iran and he created some sort of a small state. He even minted coins. Eventually, he was captured by the leader of the Abbasid revolution, the very famous Abu Muslim al-Khurasani, and put to death. Now, what's interesting about these individuals is that they are not isolated cases in that time. When we read medieval Muslim accounts about heresy, about the Ghulāt, these people and a number of others who rebelled, who made similar claims during the same decades as these guys, they are presented as deviant heretics, as anomalies, etc. And unfortunately, much of the scholarship that has been produced about them in the 20th century echoes those polemical stances, which is anachronistic because they were deviant from the point of view of later standards of orthodoxy. But if we look at the Islamic history of the 1st century after the Prophet's death, their movements were not at all isolated. Now, one of the hallmark features of their claims was that they claimed to be prophets. Each of them said, Ana Nabi or Rasul, I'm a prophet or an apostle. And of course, according to mainstream Muslim belief, this is heresy because after Muhammad, there were going to be no prophets. Of course, but we should not assume that all the Muslims after the Prophet Muhammad's death accepted this idea or were even aware of this idea. If we look at the history of the first several decades, 10 or so, or 15 decades after the Prophet's death, there's a large number of individuals claiming to be prophets. So this idea of claiming prophecy was very much in the air, and it was a continuation of the prophetic tradition of late antiquity, the history of the region, Near Eastern region, prior to the emergence of Islam. A number of large, probably around 8 or 10 individuals after the Prophet's death claimed to be prophets. For example, the most famous is Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, who conquered Kufa in the fourth or fifth decade after the Prophet's death. Then one of his followers, Hamza ibn Amr al-Barbari, he claimed to be a prophet. We don't know about Hamza, but Mukhtar was defeated and put to death. After that, another individual named Harith claimed to be a prophet in Syria, and so forth. And in the very decades when Bayan and Muawiya rebelled, there were 4 or 5 other individuals also claiming to be prophets. So this was there was lots going on confessionally. Lots of different Muslim groups were trying to figure out what's the right way to be Muslims. Many of them were using this tradition of prophecy to assert authority, and it's a very interesting historical period that's unfortunately very misunderstood, because it's been looked at from the viewpoint or through the lens not of sort of dispassionate historical investigation, but of later Muslim standards of orthodoxy, which divided Muslims into right types of Muslims and wrong types of Muslims, which is a very common way of religious polemics, found both in Christianity and in Islam, and in any religion, essentially.
If we turn our attention back toward this Mesopotamian milieu, if you will, I wonder if there is any connection between the Israeliyat and Sethian Gnosticism, as well as Sharia abrogation. If there's any connection between these 3 ideas as it relates to the Mesopotamian milieu.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard about any connection between the Israeliyat and Sethian Gnosticism, frankly. And I'm not a specialist on Gnosticism, but from what I've read, I've never seen any reference to that. So I don't really know, but I don't think so. Now, the Sharia abrogation. If we read medieval accounts, Muslim accounts of various Muslim groups, there is a special genre of writing called firaq in Arabic. In English, we customarily call this with the Greek word heresiography, coming from the Christian tradition, because in Christianity there's also this genre. Essentially, the genre consists of listing various Muslim groups or Christian groups for Christians and saying which ones are right, which ones are wrong, and describing the beliefs of each. Now, if we read medieval Muslim descriptions of various Muslim groups, many of them, the most heretical ones, so to say, and this is a very polemical term, so I'm just simply reproducing their terminology. I don't consider them heretical per se, but heretical I use as a sort of a historical term to denote those who were considered wrong by others. So many of them were accused to be the wrong type of Muslims, A, and B, to be immoral individuals. And this included a variety of charges. One was that they engaged in all kinds of immoral action, sexual licenses, wine drinking, and so forth. And a continuation of this idea was that they did this because they abrogated the Sharia, namely the Islamic law. So they considered themselves bound by no laws. Well, I've studied quite a few of these accounts, and I have come to the conclusion that most of these are simply hostile propaganda. Now, in late antiquity, both among Muslims and among early Christians, Jews, Manichaeans, Gnostics, calling someone a sexual pervert was the easiest way to smear them. So most likely there is no basis to these allegations. For example, some of the accounts say that the Ghulāt or some other groups, they did not recognize the sanctity of marriage. They had intercourse with the wives of their sons or with their mothers or sisters. Now, there's no evidence that this ever happened, and most likely this is very, very hostile propaganda. And it has parallels also in earlier Christian writings. So it's very likely that this is just simply part of a common inventory of writings. And even nowadays, when people want to smear each other, this would be a very easy way to smear, to show that someone is a pervert, to give them, to present any of these accusations. So anyways, however, there is evidence that the Ghulāt interpreted some of the Islamic rituals, for example, prayer or pilgrimage or fasting, in ways that were different from the more mainstream Muslim understanding. And it is namely that praying is not actually the performance of certain physical gestures, the physical movements or prostrations, or pilgrimage is not actually traveling to Mecca, or fasting is not actually abstaining from food for a certain period of time, but these are code names for certain individuals. So yes, those ideas are there, prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage, but they're not, that's how their reasoning went. They are not what most people think they are. So this is how they interpreted this.
And it seems then we come back to conceptions of these individuals or personalities, especially in the household of the Prophet, and these competing visions of what these personalities were. And it's interesting, you put a waymark, or almost like a waypoint, and you point us to the crisis of succession as it relates to the imams. These competing ideas of ulama abrar atqiya, which is these highly revered scholars who are, God-fearing. This conception of the Prophet's household as being these scholars who are God-fearing, as opposed to acting gods on earth. And you mentioned these two individuals, Ibn Abu Ya'fur and Mu'alla ibn Khunais. So if you could tell us a bit about the stakes at play here in these differing conceptions within the Shi'i community, and how the Ghulāt conception filtered down, even though they weren't successful. And you mentioned earlier how certain groups were made into heretics later on when these ideas were crystallized and more institutionalized. So if you could tell us a bit about how, despite the fact that the Ghulāt did not win the day, so to speak, their ideas still found their way into orthodoxy.
Yes. Some of their ideas found their way into, for example, the Shi'i canon, but in much modified form. The sort of more innocent-looking ones, for example, the idea of Ashbah and Azilla, are abundantly found in the hadith of the Shi'i canon. For example, Kulayni's Al-Kafi, which is the largest collection of Shi'i hadith, it contains a number of stories about the creation of the world and the shadows and phantoms. Other ideas were outright rejected by the emerging Imami or Shi'i orthodoxy. For example, the idea of the divinity of the Imams. So later on, when we have a crystallizing Shi'i orthodoxy, the firm position is that the Imams are merely human beings who are very knowledgeable, who are guarded from error, but they are in no way divine or superhuman. They are simply human beings. And in fact, in the very collection of Al-Kafi, Al-Kulayni's Al-Kafi, there are stories where some of the followers of the Imams, for example, the sixth Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, they are arguing about the nature of the Imam. And one of them says, hey, he's a semi-divine being. The other one says, hey, no, he's just a human being. And then the third says, well, listen, guys, we are in Medina and the Imam lives just around the corner. Let's go ask him. And so they go knock at his door and he opens and says, hey, guys, no, we are simply human beings. There is nothing divine in us. We are not superhuman or we have no supernatural powers. So Some ideas were incorporated, some were rejected, but the teachings of the Ghulāt lived on in a very rich written tradition, and namely that's the written tradition of the Nusairi's of medieval Syria. So at one point, around the early or mid 900s, some of the leaders of the Ghulāt migrated to Syria. We don't know why, but I mean, we may speculate. This was a time when in Iraq, which was the center of the Abbasid Empire, we see the crystallization of a number of religious schools, the crystallization of Islamic orthodoxy, both in its Shi'i and non-Shi'i forms. And probably this was not a good time for the Ghulāt to be there. So they migrate to Syria and they establish their center there. We know little about their actual life in Syria, but we have a large number of written texts by the Nusairis throughout centuries. For 300-400 centuries, we have huge written works left by them, which elaborate and further develop the teachings of the Ghulāt. And in many respects, they resemble the teachings of the Ghulāt. So they have the ideas of the shadows, they have the notion of the superhuman role of the Imam, but they also develop them in certain different ways. There are some details which diverge. So the Ghulāt's teachings were pretty much alive for centuries to come.
Earlier, you mentioned how there's this hierarchy, and that the Ghulāt considered there was a possibility of human worshippers becoming angels and joining them. So if you could tell us a bit more about this particular aspect of their cosmology, and then I'll move on to my next question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so thank you. That's one of their most interesting teachings, and that forms part of the overall architecture of the universe as imagined by them. Earlier, I spoke about this sort of chain of being stretching from light at the very top, and which is represented by the unknowable and ineffable God, down into the world of spirits and angels, and then humans, and then further down. So now this chain was sort of a ladder where you could move up and down. And I mentioned that the sinners were bound to go down if they didn't behave well in this life, and they were reborn into other animals, dogs, frogs, snakes, scorpions, etc. If they were good, they would be reborn into purer beings. And the very best were reborn into these semi-angelic forms. Now, there are several accounts about this. They are not very clear what actually happens. So this is what they say, most of them. They say if you're good, if you exercise spiritually, if you purify your spirit, if you're good to your believing brethren, if you do good, if you're a good human being, you never sin, you will move up the hierarchy. You will land in the higher spiritual degree. Fine. And then if you do a bit more of that, you will land in the still higher one. And then, so there are seven degrees, but we don't know what actually happens. Do you move up in this life while you're still in your current body, or you die and then you're reborn into a higher being? We don't know. They don't specify. The last degree is that of the Bab, or the gate. Again, we don't know. Are you reborn after death into that pure creature, pure being, or do you move up there and become that person while you're still in this body? It's left unexplained. Probably, I don't know for what reason. Maybe there are some other texts that would have explained, but they haven't survived. So, and then once there, this human being acquires supernatural abilities. They can travel huge distances. They can manipulate objects, and they can change their appearance and so forth. It's interesting. So it's very likely a way to explain the perception of the divinity of the Imams. How are you going to say that some human beings are almost divine? You're going to create a huge cosmological architecture where you place them at the top. So this was probably a way of explaining actually how the imams were semi-divine, because they were those the most purified human beings who had ended up at the top or who were born at the top. I don't know. It doesn't always explain.
And the paper, I find you're really scrutinizing the appellation of Gnostic to these Ghulāt groups. And one particular group, the Muawiyah, of which you've studied quite deeply, you've put a magnifying glass to their ideas and systematically compare and contrast between Gnostic ideas that were swirling around at the time. And so if we could have a closer look at one aspect of the Muawiyah as it relates to creation, and you mentioned this earlier, how creation was delegated, but if you could tell us a bit more about how it departs from those Gnostic ideas, if at all, in this specific instance.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to begin by giving a shout out to my colleague and friend Dylan Burns, who is a very well-known specialist on early Christianity, thanks to whom I was able to study this aspect of the Ghulāt and the examination of the Ghulāt's possible connections or lack thereof with the Gnostics is our collective labor. So without him, I wouldn't be able to do that work. So credits are due to him as much as to me for studying this subject. Now, how much did they depart from the Gnostics? Again, none of their ideas is purely Gnostic. So we can't say this idea is more Gnostic, the other idea is less Gnostic or departs from Gnosticism. If we look at their overall teachings, they are a sampling of many of the theological ideas swirling around in this environment in the early centuries of the Common Era, in the early decades of the Islamic era, and so forth. So it's really hard to put your finger on something and say, well, here they depart. Now, coming to the Muawiyah, it's fascinating how they define the creation of the universe. It clearly goes back to the earlier pre-Islamic ideas of the demiurge, and we find different versions of this idea, both in the teachings of the Ghulāt, in the teachings of the Manichaeans, different modifications of it. And namely, this is that the world is not the creation of God directly, but God created a first creature, and it was called, in some traditions, it's called demiurge. And that first creature then created the world. In some traditions, it was evil. In some traditions, it was good. Doesn't matter. So here in the teachings of the Muawiyah, some of the texts identify this first creature as the Prophet Muhammad. And then they go on to say that, and then Muhammad went on to create the world and care for it. Now it's interesting, probably this was already some sort of a controversial idea, although as I said, at that time, there was no clear-cut boundary between right and wrong Islamic belief because Islamic beliefs were still being formulated by various thinkers. So it was a very diverse environment. However, a couple of the accounts that speak of the Muawiyah, they don't name the Prophet's name directly. For example, one account says, oh, that name has 4 letters, and that name went on to create the world on God's behalf. And then later on in the same text, it makes allusion to Muhammad, and it only indirectly becomes clear to whom the text is referring, namely that this is Muhammad who created the world and then runs it on God's behalf.
My penultimate question would be then, the Ghulāt seem to, from your paper, draw upon Sethian Gnosticism. Could you tell us how that transmission occurs, if it was primarily oral or textual, and how then, as a scholar, you then reconstruct this transmission?
Yes. So, well, Dylan and I have spent much time thinking about this, and our conclusion is this, that Most likely there was no direct textual transmission. These people were speakers of Arabic and or Persian or Syriac, probably. The Sethian Gnostic texts were written several centuries earlier. It's very unlikely that the Ghulāt authors might have read them. What's more likely is that the ideas that echo Gnostic teachings were sort of in the air, like all of the other ideas. For example, about the demiurge creating the world. It's not that they opened a book by the Sethian Gnostics and said, this is a good idea, I'm going to copy it and edit it and present it in a different way in Arabic. Most likely, there were groups of people who had been inspired by similar teachings as those of the Sethian Gnostics, Manichaeans, and many others, and Jewish groups and early Christian groups. And many of these Ghulāt authors were simply very familiar with them. Many of them were probably formerly from those groups. Now, these are very early times in the emergence of the Islamic religion. Let's not forget that. So it means that many of the Muslims writing at that time were either first or second generation converts, which means when you're a convert, you come from another tradition, which means you bring the worldview, the ideas, the images of that tradition with you into your new religion. And what's interesting when we study the earlier period of Islamic history or any religious tradition, we should bear in mind this point. It refers to both Christianity, Islam, and any other religious tradition, especially when looking at the pre-modern period. We should never assume that all believers had a uniform understanding of tradition. Why? Because the means of communication at that time were simply not the same as they are today. Today, a Christian or a Muslim living, let's say, on the west coast of North America is more likely to have a similar belief system to a Christian or a Muslim, respectively, living in the Middle East or in East Asia. Then, in the 8th century, a Muslim or a Christian living in Baghdad, for example, and the belief system of a Muslim or Christian living in Damascus. These were not a very long distance apart, but the state of communications was such that they were likely to have very, very different ideas about the same religious tradition that they followed, because they didn't have the same print materials, the same books as we have now, the same videos, internet, television, etc. So all of these ideas are spread and reinforced through all of these media. And at that time, it was mostly word of mouth, preaching, and most people were illiterate. That's also an important thing to bear in mind.
Well, Professor, I really appreciate your time, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to say any final words before we round off.
Thank you so much, Ziryab, for having me. I just want to conclude by saying that the history of the Ghulāt is part of a larger picture of early Islamic history, which was a fascinating time. It's poorly documented. For a variety of reasons, much of the written material has either been lost or there simply isn't that much written material at all. So by studying the history and teachings of the Ghulāt, we gain an intimate idea about what kind of diverse world we are dealing with in the early Islamic centuries.
Wonderful. Thank you again for sharing your time with us today, Professor, and we hope that we can do this again sometime.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.